Here is we call the fathead model, and this one has a piece of skull that attaches to the head, and you can see that we can look into this skull, and right over here we have indicated the dural sinus called the superior sagittal sinus. It goes right in the sagittal plane. It's located right in the sagittal plane, and where you see the yellow, that outlines exactly where you would find it underneath the skull, along the midline. Here is another view of the same skull, and right over here you can see the continuation of this superior sagittal sinus, and it comes right over here where there is what is called the confluence of the sinuses, and right here is one of the transverse sinuses, and here's the other one. You can see why it's called the transverse sinus, because these sinuses are oriented in the transverse plane inside the skull. Here is another view of a different model. This is the clear model of the brain, and here is a piece of the skull. This is the back part of the skull. We'll learn later that this is called the occipital bone right there. And this clear area right over here represents the brain, and here is a bit of the dura mater, that is left inside this model. And right over here where you see the blue, this indicates the location of the superior sagittal sinus again. So this is the superior sagittal sinus from yet another view, another model. And you can see it's like a V-shaped trough that is within this dura mater. And so this is a space, and so it's called a sinus, a dural sinus. And so I've indicated that it is along the sagittal plane, and right over here is the confluence of the sinus that would be going into the transverse sinuses. Here is another view of the same model, looking at essentially the same dural sinus right over here, the superior sagittal sinus, and right down over here is the confluence of the sinuses, and here is one of the dural sinuses known as the transverse sinus, and there's the other transverse sinus, and the blood would flow like that from the superior sagittal sinus into the transverse sinuses, and you can see they would flow around like that. Here is an inside view of the same model, and here you can see again the superior sagittal sinus going to the confluence of sinuses and then going into the transverse sinuses on either side. Here is another view, again superior sagittal sinus going into the transverse sinus on one side and the transverse sinus on the other side. That's how again the blood would flow as it is draining from the skull, having come from the brain. And here we have a better view of what happens to the transverse sinuses. So here is again the superior sagittal sinus from this view going into the transverse sinuses. And what happens is that right over here the blood drains into an S-shaped sinus that is called the sigmoid sinus, and then finally drains out right over here into the interior jugular vein. So the interior jugular vein will be located right over here. And here it is on the other side. So you can see it's kind of shaped, and that's why it's called the sigmoid sinus, which essentially means it's like shaped like an S. Here's a better view of the sigmoid sinus on the other side. And again, here is the transverse sinus, and there's the sigmoid sinus, and right over here in this area would drain into the internal jugular vein.